$60 billion. That is the size of Russia's federal budget deficit in just the first quarter of 2026, a single quarter. And that number comes not from a Western think tank, not from a Ukrainian government briefing. It comes directly from Russia's own Ministry of Finance. Let that sink in for a moment. At the same time, Russia's official unemployment rate sits at 2.1%. By that measure alone, you might conclude the Russian labor market is thriving, and that is precisely what the Kremlin wants you to conclude. But here is what that number does not tell you. Factories across Russia are shifting to 3- and 4-day work weeks. 2 of Russia's largest vehicle manufacturers have halted or cut production. A major tank manufacturing facility announced mass layoffs affecting up to 50% of staff in certain units. A 2.1% unemployment rate and a collapsing industrial base in the same country at the same time. That is not a paradox. That is a symptom. In this video, I am going to give you a strategic lens that most mainstream coverage simply does not apply. We are going to look past the headline numbers and examine the structural machinery underneath the labor crisis, the budget arithmetic, the energy dependency, and what all of it means for the trajectory of the Russian economy under the weight of a war now entering its 5th year. Because the most important story here is not what is breaking down, it is why it cannot be fixed. Let us start with what Russia's own leadership has admitted. In early 2026, Vladimir Putin convened a meeting on economic issues and made a public statement that, by the standards of Kremlin communication, was remarkably direct. He announced that Russia's gross domestic product contracted by 1.8% across January and February, compared to the same period in 2025. He also acknowledged that manufacturing, industrial production, and construction, his word, not mine, had suffered losses. This was not a leak. This was not Western intelligence analysis. This was the president of Russia on the record, confirming economic contraction. Now place that admission in context. In 2024, Russia's GDP grew at nearly 5%. In 2025, that figure dropped to 1%. And now, in the opening months of 2026, the economy is not just slowing, it is actively shrinking. That is a trajectory, not an anomaly, and trajectories carry momentum. But here is where the numbers become genuinely interesting. Russia's central bank projected GDP growth of 1.6% for the first quarter of 2026. The Russian Academy of Sciences projected a year-on-year decline of 1.5% for the same period. 2 institutions, both operating within the Russian state apparatus, producing forecasts that are 3 full percentage points apart. When official bodies within the same government cannot agree on the direction of the economy, not just the magnitude, but the actual direction, that divergence itself tells you something important about the reliability of the data environment. Analysts and independent observers would be right to approach all Russian economic figures with structured skepticism, not dismissal, but calibrated scrutiny. Now let us move to the budget. According to an April 8th press release from Russia's Ministry of Finance, federal budget revenues for the first quarter of 2026 were 8.2% lower than during the same period in 2025. Federal expenditures, meanwhile, rose by 17%. The result is a structural gap that produced a deficit exceeding $60 billion in a single quarter during a period when Russia is simultaneously financing a large-scale military operation. The critical pressure point within that budget is energy. The Oxford Institute for Energy Studies notes that taxation on oil and gas revenue typically accounts for between 30 and 50% of Russia's federal budget receipts, with the energy sector representing approximately 20% of total GDP. In the first quarter of 2026, oil and gas revenues fell 45.4% compared to the prior year. Non-energy tax revenues grew by 7.1%, nowhere near enough to compensate. The fiscal arithmetic here is not subtle. Russia responded by suspending gold and foreign currency transactions until July 1st, a decision that signals pressure on reserve management, though the full scope of that pressure remains difficult to assess from outside the system. At the industrial level, the deterioration is broad-based. Construction output fell 16% year-on-year in January, followed by a further 14% decline in February. Manufacturing contracted 2.9% across the first 2 months of the year. Russia's cargo transport volume dropped to its lowest point since 2020, the height of the global pandemic disruption. These are not numbers from adversarial sources. These figures are drawn from Russian central bank monitoring data, government ministry releases, and reporting by established international outlets, including Reuters. The evidence does not require editorializing. But here is what these numbers still do not explain, and this is the part that most analysis stops short of examining. Why, with unemployment at a record low, are Russian businesses simultaneously cutting shifts, halting production lines, and laying off workers at scale? That contradiction is not an accident. It is the signature of a specific kind of economic dysfunction. And understanding it requires looking beneath the surface of the labor market data entirely. Here is the answer to the contradiction. Russia's labor market is not functioning well. It is functioning under extreme duress, and the two look identical on a spreadsheet until the moment they do not. A 2.1% unemployment rate in a healthy economy means workers are productively employed, businesses are generating revenue, and the system is operating near its natural capacity. A 2.1% unemployment rate in a war economy means something structurally different. It can mean that a significant portion of the working-age male population has been removed from the civilian labor force entirely through military mobilization, casualties, emigration, or some combination of all three. According to the American Foreign Policy Council, Russia entered this conflict already facing a severe demographic and labor shortage. Even before accounting for war-related losses, analysts estimated that Russia would need to absorb approximately 550,000 migrants annually just to prevent its overall population from shrinking. That baseline deficit existed before a single soldier crossed the border into Ukraine. Now layer on top of that the scale of the conflict itself. Ukraine has claimed Russian casualties exceeding 1.3 million since the invasion began. That figure has not been independently verified, and Western intelligence estimates vary considerably. But even the most conservative assessments confirm losses in the hundreds of thousands, the overwhelming majority of whom were working-age men drawn from Russia's civilian labor pool. The result is a labor market that registers near zero unemployment, not because everyone has a good job, but because there are genuinely fewer people available to fill the jobs that exist. This is scarcity masquerading as prosperity. And scarcity has a price. When businesses compete for a shrinking pool of available workers, wages rise. That is elementary economics. But in Russia's current environment, those rising wages are not being driven by productivity gains or expanding output. They are being driven by desperation. Elvira Nabiullina, the governor of Russia's central bank, stated publicly in April that the labor shortage has become the primary threat to price stability in the country. Businesses are being forced to raise wages simply to retain staff, and those higher labor costs are flowing directly into production costs, and from there into consumer prices. This is the wage inflation spiral, and it is running simultaneously with an economy that is contracting. Think carefully about what that means. Prices are rising, output is falling. The central bank's benchmark interest rate remains elevated with no near-term path to meaningful reduction. Investment into Russian business fell 2.3% in 2025, and Russia's Ministry of Economic Development has projected a further decline in 2026. The only source of capital investment flowing into Russian companies right now is those companies investing in themselves retained earnings where they exist. When revenues fall, that internal investment dries up. When investment dries up, productivity stagnates. When productivity stagnates, the labor shortage deepens further. This is not a cycle that self-corrects. This is a loop that tightens. Observe a historical parallel. During the final years of the Soviet Union, specifically the period between 1985 and 1990, official unemployment figures remained near zero. The system, by its own metrics, appeared to be fully employed. What those metrics did not capture was the dramatic collapse in labor productivity, the hollowing out of industrial output, and the widening gap between nominal wages and actual purchasing power. The numbers looked stable. The underlying structure was not. Students of that period will recognize certain architectural similarities in what Russia's data is showing today. That is not a prediction. It is a pattern worth monitoring with discipline. Now turn to the energy dimension, because this is where the analysis becomes genuinely counterintuitive. In April of 2026, Reuters reported that Russia's primary oil tax revenue was projected to double to approximately $9 billion for that month alone. The driver was not Russian policy. It was the disruption to oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz, following the escalation of tensions between the United States and Iran. With roughly 20% of global oil and liquefied natural gas supply moving through that waterway, the disruption sent prices toward the $100 per barrel range, and Russia, selling at a discount through its alternative shipping networks, benefited directly. This sounds like good news for Moscow, and in the narrowest short-term sense, it is. But consider what it actually reveals about Russia's strategic position. The single most positive development in Russia's economic data for the first quarter of 2026 is a windfall generated entirely by a geopolitical crisis in the Middle East, a crisis over which Russia has no control and which could de-escalate at any point. A Russian think tank, CMASF, noted that even under optimistic projections incorporating higher oil export prices, total economic growth for 2026 would not exceed 1.3%. The energy windfall is, in their own framing, a temporary bridge over a structural gap. This is a government patching a failing foundation with borrowed weather. And beneath that foundation, the structural rot identified by researchers Vasily Burov and Andrei Yakov, writing in Analysis published by the Moscow Times and drawing on work affiliated with Harvard University's Davis Center, predates the war by years. Their core argument, presented as academic analysis, is that Russia made a deliberate choice over many years to concentrate economic resources among a narrow set of political and commercial elites, systematically underinvesting in infrastructure, social services, and the productive capacity of regions outside Moscow. The war did not create this architecture. It accelerated it and made it visible. What does that mean in practical terms? It means that the end of the military conflict in Ukraine, whatever form that eventually takes, would not automatically reset Russia's economic trajectory. The labor deficit would remain. The capital investment gap would remain. The structural dependency on energy revenues would remain. The concentration of wealth at the top of the system would remain, because that concentration is the system, not a flaw within it. There is no external shock that fixes an internal architecture problem. And this brings us to the dimension of this story that almost no mainstream analysis has adequately addressed. The question is not whether Russia's economy is under pressure. The data confirms that it is. The deeper question is, what happens to a large nuclear-armed state when its war economy becomes the primary engine of domestic demand, and what the exit from that condition looks like, structurally and politically? That question does not have a clean answer, but it is the question that every serious observer of this situation should be asking right now. You do not need to live in Moscow to feel what is happening inside Russia's economy. That is the part of this story that rarely makes it into the analysis. The focus stays on Kremlin press conferences, on central bank forecasts, on GDP figures measured in trillions of rubles. But the mechanics of what we have just examined do not stay contained within Russian borders. They travel through energy markets, through commodity supply chains, through the interest rate decisions of central banks on the other side of the world. Let us trace that transmission carefully. Start with oil. Russia is not a marginal producer. It is one of the largest exporters of crude oil on the planet, and the disruption to global energy flows, compounded by the ongoing situation in the Strait of Hormuz, has pushed prices toward the $100 per barrel threshold. At that price level, the cost does not stay on a commodity exchange. It moves. It moves into the price of aviation fuel, which moves into the price of every product that travels by air. It moves into diesel, which moves into the cost of every truck on every highway, delivering every product to every store shelf. It moves into the heating bills of households across Europe and Asia, who have already spent years restructuring their energy imports away from Russian supply, a restructuring that came with its own considerable price tag. Every $10 increase in the price of a barrel of oil adds measurable upward pressure to global logistics costs. That pressure does not announce itself. It arrives quietly, embedded in the price of groceries, in the surcharges attached to shipping invoices, in the margins that small businesses can no longer absorb and therefore pass directly to consumers. This is what economists mean when they describe an inflationary transmission mechanism. It is invisible until it is in your wallet. Now move beyond energy to the broader commodity picture. Russia is a significant global supplier of palladium, of titanium, of wheat, and of fertilizers derived from natural gas. These are not luxury inputs. Palladium is a critical component in catalytic converters. Its supply constraints ripple directly into automotive manufacturing costs. Titanium is foundational to aerospace production. Fertilizers determine the input costs of agriculture at industrial scale, which means they determine, with a lag of one growing season, the price of food. When a major supplier of these materials faces sustained internal economic deterioration, reduced industrial output, capital investment decline, logistics contraction, the question of supply reliability becomes a live variable for every industry downstream. Companies that depend on these inputs begin building contingency margins into their pricing. Those margins are not absorbed by shareholders. They are passed through the supply chain until they reach the end consumer, you, paying more, for reasons that were decided thousands of miles away. There is a second-order effect that receives even less attention. The central banks of Europe, the United Kingdom, and to some degree the United States have spent the past several years navigating the tension between controlling inflation and avoiding economic contraction. That balance is extraordinarily sensitive to external commodity shocks. When energy prices spike due to geopolitical disruption, central banks face pressure to maintain higher interest rates for longer than their domestic economic conditions would otherwise require, because cutting rates into an inflationary environment risks losing control of price stability entirely. Higher interest rates for longer means more expensive mortgages. It means higher borrowing costs for businesses investing in expansion or equipment. It means tighter credit conditions for small and medium enterprises that run on financing. It means the cost of carrying debt, personal, corporate, governmental, rises across the board. A factory in the Ural region cutting its workforce to a 3-day work week is not, on the surface, your problem. But the chain of consequences that factory represents the commodity it no longer produces, the export it no longer fulfills, the price signal it sends into a global market already under pressure, that chain does not stop at any border. The global economy is not a collection of separate systems. It is one system, running on interdependent inputs, priced in the same currencies, move through the same shipping lanes. And when one of its largest nodes begins to structurally contract under the weight of a war economy, it cannot sustain and cannot easily exit. Everyone downstream adjusts. The question is, how much further that adjustment has to go? Before we draw any conclusions, intellectual honesty requires something that most commentary on this subject refuses to do. It requires taking the counter-argument seriously. Because the case that Russia is heading toward inevitable economic collapse has been made before. It has been made confidently by credentialed analysts with data to support it, and it has been wrong before. That history matters. It should discipline how certain any of us are willing to be about what comes next. Consider the record. In 2014 and 2015, Russia faced a simultaneous shock of Western sanctions following the annexation of Crimea and a collapse in global oil prices from over $100 per barrel to below $30 in the span of 18 months. At that point, numerous analysts projected severe and sustained economic deterioration. Russia's economy did contract by roughly 2% in 2015, but it stabilized, it adapted, it did not collapse. In February of 2022, following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the most sweeping package of coordinated Western sanctions in modern history was imposed on the Russian economy. The ruble lost nearly half its value within days. Predictions of economic freefall were widespread. And yet, by 2023 and 2024, Russia's GDP was growing at 4 to 5% annually, driven substantially by war production, government spending, and the redirection of trade toward China, India, and other non-Western partners. These are not small data points. They represent genuine evidence of an economy with real adaptive capacity. Several analysts and institutional observers have noted that Russia's pivot toward Asian markets has been more successful than many Western policymakers anticipated. China has significantly increased its purchases of Russian energy. India has become a major buyer of discounted Russian crude. The so-called shadow fleet of tankers has allowed Russia to maintain oil export volumes despite Western shipping restrictions. None of this appears in the Kremlin's favor as a matter of political judgment, but as a matter of economic analysis. The adaptive mechanisms are real and should not be dismissed. There is also a structural argument worth acknowledging. Russia's government debt as a proportion of GDP remains relatively low by international comparison. That provides some fiscal buffer, a capacity to absorb deficit spending over a longer period than a more heavily indebted government might manage. So where does that leave us? The counter-argument establishes something important. Russia has repeatedly demonstrated an ability to absorb shocks that external observers expected to be fatal. That pattern deserves respect. But here is where this cycle differs in ways that are structurally significant. Previous crises were external shocks, sudden, acute, and ultimately time-limited. A price crash, a sanctions package, shocks that a system can absorb, restructure around, and eventually stabilize against. What Russia is experiencing now is not primarily an external shock. It is internal structural erosion, a labor base that cannot be rebuilt quickly, a capital investment trajectory that is declining, a demographic deficit that compounds annually, and a budget architecture that has reorganized itself around military expenditure with no clear mechanism for reversal. External shock test a system's resilience. Structural erosion undermines the system's capacity for resilience itself. That distinction is not a minor analytical nuance. It is the entire argument. Let us bring the full picture into focus. Three things are now clearly established by the data. Russia's economy is contracting at the macroeconomic level, confirmed by its own government's figures. Its industrial base is deteriorating across multiple sectors simultaneously: construction, manufacturing, automotive, logistics. And its single most important revenue source, energy, is currently propped up by a geopolitical crisis in the Middle East that Russia did not engineer and cannot control. Underneath all of that sits a structural labor crisis that cannot be resolved by policy adjustments, a capital investment decline that feeds on itself, and a budget architecture that has become dependent on military expenditure to sustain domestic demand, creating a system that now requires the continuation of the very conditions driving its deterioration. This is not a recession. A recession has a bottom, and a bottom has a recovery. What Russia is navigating is a structural reorientation of its entire economic model under wartime conditions, with no clear exit pathway that does not require dismantling the political arrangements that currently hold the system together. And that is precisely where where the most consequential question sits, unanswered. If the war in Ukraine were to end tomorrow through negotiation, through exhaustion, through any mechanism, what does the Russian economy actually return to? Not the economy of 2021. That economy no longer exists in the same form. The labor pool has changed. The trade architecture has changed. The investment environment has changed. The budget dependency has changed. The morning after a ceasefire, Russia would still face every structural problem we have examined in this video, just without the war production revenue partially masking them. What happens then? Who fills that fiscal gap? What replaces the demand that military spending has been generating? And critically, which direction does a nuclear-armed state move when its economic model reaches the end of its viable runway? Those are not rhetorical questions. They are the questions that the next phase of this story will answer. And we will be here to analyze every move as it unfolds. If this kind of strategic analysis is what you are looking for, grounded in data, built on evidence, free from the noise of headlines, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. The situation is moving faster than the news cycle can track. We will keep pace. One Souther in She can the 14 the 12 or in.